Lanigan used to drive me home at night from the sessions.
Really?
And I wasn't living in the nicest apartment. And this sounds melodramatic, but I think I talked him into quitting 2 or 3 times.
Really?
And it was like, he's dropping me off and we get into a conversation and it turns into a half an hour kind of deep thing,
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I mean, things weren't going great for me. Certainly wasn't going great for him.
What was your relationship like with Mark? I mean, that was a really deep story you shared. Like, were you guys very close? Like, what was, if you're comfortable talking about that, what was things like with him?
Well, it's 2022 and there's so many, oh, I was this good best buddy, whatever. So I don't want to make us sound closer than we were, but we were close. We did a lot of our vocal stuff on our own. It wasn't. I think he liked that. There were a lot of evenings where people showed up, but they all started with me and Lanigan working on our own. And here's a fun story. Mark Lanigan, who became good at producing himself, but when we were working on this one Screaming Trees mix, there's this thing that, once again, young people don't understand this, but the kind of variation there is with analog playback between different machines. So you can make the best mix in the world, put it on a cassette, and then you play it in your car, and it doesn't make any sense. And that has to do with the alignment of the head and how clean the head is and all kinds of things. The same thing with the speakers and what the car does. So we had a Screaming Tree song we were trying to nail. And it was over the Christmas break. And so no one was coming into the studio. And so, and Sam was cool, the studio owner, but me and Lanigan left this one song up on the mixing console for like 3 days. And we'd work on it. And then he'd come back the next day and go, it still sucks. I'm still not doing a very good Mark impersonation. I haven't done one yet. I used to, when I smoked, I could do it really well. But anyway, on the third day, I said, well, maybe we should go back to your place and see what it sounds like there. So instead of you telling me about it, and we got back to his place, and once again, I'm going to draw it in the middle of the screen here, but you walked into his place and he had 2 pretty big speakers, 70s speakers. God knows if they were still working, but they're on the floor, which means they're already adding an octave to the bass because they're on the floor. And Mark's room had a long hallway. So you walk in and there's a closet and there's a long hallway, and speaker 1 is here and speaker 2 is at the back of the hallway. And speaker 1 has a giant pile of sweaters and laundry in front of the speaker. And so I looked at it and says, first off, stereo doesn't live with this depth perception thing. So you don't have the left, 20 feet behind the right. And then check this out. And I moved the laundry out of the way and it sounded really good. And Mark, I can't do it, but he was obviously very angry with himself for half a second.
He didn't think of moving the laundry?
Yeah. He didn't think to move the laundry,
That's funny, man. So what was it like working with Mark Lanigan as a vocalist?
Well, I think the longer he sang, the more he figured out what he could do with that bass register, that low tenor thing. That's kind of his signature now.
Did you ever double his voice?
A lot of the time, yeah. He'd chew tobacco.
As he was singing?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
It was always hard to make his voice read against all those guitar overdubs. Mark learned the hard way that if you leave Lee on his own, he'll just do guitar overdubs. By the time we got to mixing the Invisible Lantern record, Mark was like, what? No.
That's funny.
He was at home in his low octave, which hadn't really blossomed yet. Mark Lanigan, as we know him now, you can start to hear, that thing kind of jump out where the screams all land, and when he goes for a big note, he's got the right lyric and the right turn and the right push behind it. There was a couple of moments where I went like, oh shit, he's really turning into something really wonderful, and he was always good and he was always lyric and melodic. If he wasn't happy, then the whole vibe got just, then there was no vibe and you were just trying to make Mark happy. But Mark was also in a lot of physical pain. and he had really bad headaches, and he was totally sober the whole time. It's none of my fucking business, but when you're making a complete commitment to doing psychedelic records, I was the only guy that smoked pot. Nobody smoked pot. A couple of guys in the band drank a little bit, but Mark was serious about doing it. I mean, and we went through a kind of a sound search on his voice and played with different kinds of compression and turning off compression. So no, there was a whole very concerted effort. We started with this Neumann because it was the best, that KM84 I was telling you about earlier. I think that's the vocal mic on Other Worlds and Clairvoyance, and eventually we switched over to an SM58, which is kind of a pedestrian microphone, but it's a great microphone to scream into. I know you had a whole video about Kurt Cobain screaming in microphones and all of that. But Mudhoney, we're using SM58s. Everybody's using SM58s, so we just quit fucking around with trying to do something high quality or fancy and just use an SM58. So yeah, Invisible Lantern, and even if and especially when we're just Mark singing into a mic on a stand. One of the other things you got to think about too is when you have an 8-track, that means at a certain point you have to erase the scratch vocal. There's no way to save the scratch vocal. And even though the sound was shitty and there was tons of bleed, Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals were so good. And I would try to talk him out of it, but there wasn't like any fancy digital thing where you could bounce it off someplace with the idea that eventually you'd figure out some way to use it or something like that. And it didn't sound anything like a real vocal because it had guitars and cymbals and everything in it. But Mark Lanigan's scratch vocals, he delivered on every fucking take. There wasn't a scratch vocal that wasn't as good as it could get. As somebody who later really learned how to recognize a good take, the idea that there aren't any live Mark Lanigan takes from that whole period where I worked with him, I'm just embarrassed. That's just stupid. But that's just the reality of it. And then it's also, that's working with an artist and understanding is like, there's no way I'm putting that vocal out,
Yeah,
so,
no, I hear you. So I mean,
erase it,
So would he be the kind of person that he would sing like 15, 20 minutes, take a break and come back? Or would he be one of the guys that would go for like 2 hours straight? Like what was he like in that regard?
I think we had evenings where we just sang vocals, 4 hours of singing, 3 hours of singing. It was just like at a certain point, there was just sort of a workman, thing. We're like, all right, we've done all the guitars, let's do all the vocals. I didn't know anything about different kinds of singers. I hadn't learned so I learned a lot about recording vocals working with Lanigan, and I think we tried all kinds of things, Remember there was one song, I forgot which one it was. I'm pretty sure it was Invisible Lantern song where Mark didn't want to finish it or didn't want to finish writing the words or something. Forget what the thing was, and he made like a whole party out of it where it says, okay, Rod Doak, the sound like, you go sing it now. Okay, Lee, you sing it now. And Lee would go out and do his version of it, and we make a mix of that. And it says, okay, Fisk, you go out and sing it now. So there's this one song that's got, and there's this cassette of it somewhere, maybe it's gone by now, but it's just me doing all these rough mixes of like these, everybody in the studio sang the song because Mark was just having fun kind of not finishing the vocal.
That's funny. So in general, like how many takes would you get for his vocals? Like would you do a lot of takes or just not that many?
It seemed to go well. He was never like, hey, I just nailed that. He's not that kind of guy. So even when it was great, he still had all kinds of misgivings, but he could walk away from it going, that's as good as it's going to get tonight. Neither of us knew what we were doing. We figured out in SM58, and I think there was an old Symmetrix 522 compressor. He just did a great job of figuring out his shit, and it was by a lot of learn by by doing kind of thing. So he a lot of shit was good enough, but for him, he's got a kind of a relentless thing about perfection and all of that. So I think that drove him to do all this other God, it's really inaccurate, really, really badly worded. But what he turned into was because he wasn't happy with what he was. And without getting into the book, but the idea that he was saddled with doing this kind of genre music, the psychedelic thing, it's like he loved it, he dug it, but like all the Screaming Trees, he listened to tons of music. So the idea that he doesn't want to talk about, the old stuff or play the old songs or anything like that, I mean, that makes complete sense. It was where he landed. It's how he got started, but I don't think it was his first love.
Yeah, fair enough.
And in a small town, there's not another band, so I think he loved all these guys, but wasn't necessarily a good fit from the beginning, and then you go to Seattle, and then you're in the goddamn 90s, and you're from Eastern Washington, so you're not part of the UW hipster thing or the North End metal thing or any of this shit. So they're outsiders in the middle of this thing that's incredibly political and high pressure and weird, and surprised they got to be friends with Nirvana, also the Hicks from the middle of nowhere.
Maybe that's why they connected.
Yeah.
Would you know how the band wrote songs and came up with their different music and melodies and stuff?
I think Lee was kind of Pete Townsend.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know how much of the time, but a lot of the time there were fully fleshed out demos where Lee had written the lyrics or some approximation of the lyrics and sang them, and I think the better they got at recording, more it was demos with the actual Screaming Trees involved. I wasn't witness for any of this stuff, but a lot of it was Lanigan taking Lee's original idea and making it into something that he could bring his voice and his color and his character to. And so there was a lot of lyric rewrites and things like that, but I think there's some Lanigan stuff that started from scratch, where he wrote the melody, he wrote the words.
That's cool.
But at least in the old days, once again, they were very young, they weren't used to recording, and so Lee just knew how to do this, this thing he did. I mean, he still does it now in his solo music and all of that. He had kind of the sound and the vibe and the attitude all worked out. So the Screaming Trees weren't that, but a lot of the songs started that way.
Interesting. And so where would Van and Mark Pickerel fall into this picture when it came to the creative side of things?
Well, that was where some of the grief was. Pickerel would come up with his own drum parts, and then Lee and Van, they were two brothers and playing almost the same instruments. So where it changed and how it worked, I mean, yeah, a lot of that got worked out in the studio, and sometimes it was smooth, and sometimes they had to quarrel about it. A lot of quarrels.
Hey, but I'm sure that tension kind of actually added to the creativity in a way. So.
Oh yeah, exactly. No, there was no absence of tension. Whether it's the fact that you're playing with your brother, or you're playing with your friends that you've known for 10 years, or that like I was saying, the whole world is watching, or that this guy that we used to think was the coolest guy in the world, and he's working on our third record, and maybe we can't trust him anymore. Stuff like that. I'm sure that'll cross them.
That's funny.
Part of being involved with the Screaming Trees was that by one way or another, we were all part of the Connor family. I got so much love from the Connor family, and Mom in particular. She's passed away now, but you can imagine what it's like. I was a weirdo from the big city that came in and recorded their kids, and and all of this. So we got to be pretty good friends, and then also, I mean, that's part of being in a family, is that people are a little less diplomatic. All four of us were talking around this table in the studio, and I had a terrible back then, all kinds of sciatica, and the chairs at the studio were always falling apart. So I've been involved in this kind of intense conversation with them, and I had to stand up to stretch my back, and Lanigan went, "Oh,"
okay,
we're gonna get into it now, and then the other three guys backed up to the edge of they got ready for us to start throwing kids. Yeah, it didn't happen.
How exactly did your relationship with the Trees begin?
I had my own small record company with some friends, and one of the things I did, I went back to visit Ellensburg, where I'd gone to college, and I dropped some records off in the record store. Now, that record store figures prominently in the Screaming Trees history. So this guy, Tim Nelson, who's passed on now, and maybe the archetype for the comic book guy on The Simpsons.
Really?
Yeah, I could get into that story, but we don't have time. But anyway, he ran a used comic book record store in Ellensburg, Washington. Calvin Johnson from Beat Happening used to go there all the time when he was a kid. And of course, the Screaming Trees, that's where they would buy records. Not a lot of record stores in Ellensburg. So I left my 45 there, and Mark Pickerel bought a copy of it.
That's cool.
And wrote me a very nice letter when I was living in Oakland. And I just was just so cosmic to say, oh, wow.
That's cool.
This is closing a loop. This is very wonderful. And so when I got to Ellensburg the second time, which is I moved to Ellensburg, and the first thing I did, I think on the first night I got into Ellensburg, I was went to the record store and said, "Where's Mark Pickerel? I'm going to meet this kid." And he was working at the video store, and he had no idea that I was moving to Ellensburg or any of this. So I just walked up to him cold and said, "Hi, I'm Steve Fisk," and we had a great conversation and talked a bunch about music. And I met Gary Lee that night, and Lanigan, and maybe Van as well.
That's cool.
So that's how we met, because I put out a record a long time ago.
That's awesome.
Mark Pickerel was a record head, and there was a record store.
That's awesome. So how did you end up working on their debut EP, Other Worlds?
It's the short way to do this. I was working on something in the control room.
At which studio, if I may ask?
This is Velvetone.
Okay.
This is my friend Sam Albright. Had a business downstairs that he ran for his father, and then upstairs was just up for grabs. It was an old gold rush hotel. There had been a fire and burned everything out, so they're rebuilding it from the ground up, right next to the railroad train. So this is how Ellensburg got to Seattle in the old days. And yeah, so by this point, I'd moved back to Ellensburg, and the engineer that had been working there was getting ready to leave and go to New York. He had built a place, he split, and then all of a sudden I was there. And, I knew how to run a 4-track. And I knew how to run a synthesizer studio. I did not know how to record a rock band. Gary Lee Conner came in, so we said, "Gary Lee Conner wants to talk to you." I think they called him Lee Conner. I think we knew him as Lee Conner back then. And he came in and was a little nervous, but asked, if, the Screaming Trees could record there. Of course, we said yes. And Sam was starting a label at the same time. And the Screaming Trees ended up being the second band on the label. The Other World session was probably, remember more vividly than some of the other ones, just because it happened so quickly. They went out in this huge studio. The studio was big. It had very high ceilings, was trapezoidal, beautiful mitered wood floor, and then carpeting. So on different surfaces, just a great place to record. And they set up facing the control room like we were looking at them on stage. So they just set up like the Screaming Trees and just blew the set down. I think we stopped the tape, but they pretty much just played it as is. And then Mark, redid the vocals, and I played some keyboards on it. And I think we had it mixed like within a week or something like that. We came back for some overdubs and then mixed the record. And then, yeah, it became, they put out a cassette originally. So it was this little red cassette with somebody that looks like Mark Lanigan on the cover, but it isn't. It's
really?
Silhouette. Yes.
Oh,
yeah,
what's the story there?
If you've seen the Other Worlds, yeah, you can Google Other Worlds and see this. It's something Mark Lanigan would never do. It's like, he's in a forest holding a wand,
That's funny.
I'm sure it's something Gary Lee found. It's like, oh, that's great. That looks like Lanigan.
That's funny. So what did you think of I guess when you were in studio with the band, at what point did you feel like, oh, this is a good band? Like, was it during the recording? Was it when you finished the EP? When was that kind of moment for you when you first started to like them?
The minute they started playing.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, because they were a great, great live band. And I don't think they had a lot of live experience. I think they'd only played one gig at this point, but they really had their thing together. And their thing together, the thing that they understood was that to do the kind of music they wanted to do, you had to perform it. You had to grab it by the neck, and just be that thing, So they knew how to do that. They were totally uninhibited and also melodic.
Yeah.
This is, Gary Lee, this I mean this as a compliment, but he had form down. He knew how to write that kind of song. He knew that time period and that style of music, and he knew what he loved out of it. And so it was very easy for him to say, all right, you do this, you do this, you do this. And then Van does what he does anyway, because they're brothers. He's not going to listen to his brother. And Mark Lanigan, just brought it, and you can hear it over the records. I mean, he kind of turned into Mark Lanigan by Invisible Lantern.
Yeah, for sure.
But he was amazing. I don't listen to the Screaming Trees records for a million reasons, which I can't really describe here, but they're all tied to this giant nightmare that was the late 80s into the 90s. So I don't spend a lot of time with the records, but I've been listening to them a little bit, getting ready to come to this interview. And I was going, why does Other Worlds sound perfect? Why does Clairvoyance sound this good? I didn't know what I was doing. Sam had a lot to do with showing me how to run his studio. The session I'd done right before this was a country western session with some reasonably pro players from Yakima. And so that's kind of easy to get right. There's no big level surges. Nothing goes wild. It's just country guys in a room. And I basically used the same setup to record Other Worlds, which meant that I was, compressing the mics through the low rent compressors we had available and are somewhat okay, but not top of the line equipment we had to work with. So I don't want to sound like a snob. I was very happy to be working there. But I did a lot of sort of smashing everything and tweaking everything on the way in. And then Clairvoyance, I was even more worried about making something good, knowing the Screaming Trees are now being listened to. Just the cassette got them a lot of attention. And that was a whole thing where the drums are tracked across 5 channels and then bounced down to 2 channels using a DVX noise encoding thing, which is a real old-fashioned trick. But the point was the drums sound huge and have this kind of pumping quality that has to do with the encoding playback. But also means that you have to work to that drum balance for the rest of the mix. Means that the kick and the snare can't change levels.
Gotcha.
You can make it brighter, you can make it duller, but the decisions you made early on, you made. And the engineer that was leaving, before he left, we had this amazing early digital reverb, a Lexicon 200, which people kind of laugh at now. But I think the earlier digital technology, it didn't have all the precision of the high end, so it made it milkier and deeper and more like Joy Division or something like that. So, I printed all that crap on the drums on Clairvoyance. So that made the Clairvoyance drum sound kind of big and FM radio and not psychedelic, and might be like the biggest drum sound I'd made in my career up till then, so cool. And then everybody chimed in and put the shit on top of it. But it's an 8-track, so it's always a matter of negotiating space. All the Screaming Trees records I worked on were 8-track. I think Jack and Dino, when he recorded their record,
Buzz Factor.
I think they were 16 by that point, but they just gone 16. In the early days, everybody was on 8-track, which is an interesting thing to talk about. I mentioned this in other interviews. The half-inch 8-track, especially the Otari MX 5050B, that was what was in all of these low-rent studios that everybody was recording in, and there's a sound to it, and it's a good sound. The thing that's good about Otari Pro Decks is in this small machine. So if you hit it extra hard, something magic happens to something instead of something stupid happening, like what happens with a Tascam machine.
Gotcha.
So Dinosaur Jr. were working on that. Screaming Trees were working on that format. Soundgarden was working on that format. Mudhoney was working on that format. So listening to a record, that means you're kind of, that's old school. That means you're making a lot of decisions ahead of time and saying, okay, we can't change this. We're recording this. We're going to build on top of it. This is like what the Beatles did, except, we didn't have a machine to bounce to, but it's a whole other way of working. And that magical kind of distortion, the kind of friendly clipping you get with the Otari is also a link. And tape, because tape's gone now. So you can definitely hear the sound of the half-inch tape across all those records. I forget, I think it's on Bug. There's one place on Bug where the overdubs stop and it just turns into a 3-piece and they jam out for a while. And it just magically sounds like, it sounds like the Clairvoyance track on the Clairvoyance record, that slow, fast, slow thing at the end of side 2. Yeah. And it was like, fuck, this sounds exactly like the Screaming Trees. Because all of a sudden it was a 3-piece just rocking out in the room, recorded on a half-inch 8-track,
That's awesome. So what was it like working on their record Invisible Lantern a few years later when they were getting more attention?
It was good. It was wonderful that the Screaming Trees were being heard. the Screaming Trees had gone from being fans of that musical environment to being contemporaries in that musical environment. Cool. They got to Seattle and were celebrated in Seattle. People love the Screaming Trees in Seattle. So the game was on by Invisible Lantern. I think there's 2 other versions of the record.
Really?
A lot got recorded, yeah. Van did a couple of songs where he wrote them and sang them. And he's great. And there was some weird stuff. There's a whole song we did with them out on the street in front of the studio in the middle of the night.
Really?
Yeah, and I've never done anything like this with anybody ever, and they drove it. I wasn't telling them what to do. This was just something they wanted to do. And so imagine, okay, here's the train station, and here's the train track, here's the recording studio, here's the cool little park with an old caboose in it, and then here's the track that leads out to the cannery, right? So if we're looking at it overhead, right, there's a little field next to the studio. Lanigan's there on an SM58, okay. Tons of mic cable, right? Lee is across the street at the park playing an acoustic guitar. Pickerel's a little further down the way towards town, and he's got a 2x4. And so he's playing a rhythm, okay. And it's bouncing off the train station and bouncing back. So it's actually making a rhythmic echo. So Mark's got this kind of hand jive going with a 2x4 on the brick. And then Van is way down here playing a trumpet because there's trumpet players all through the Connor family. Everybody rocks on the trumpet. Van is back there doing kind of Italian Morricone baleful trumpet part, and Lanigan was singing kind of in the bushes in the dark. And
that's so cool.
It's on a cassette someplace. Somebody's got it somewhere. I forgot what it was called, and I think they redid the song as a real song, and that might have got released, but I can't even remember what fucking song it was.
It's hilarious. So I mean, how would you set up the mics for that?
Nobody did that in Seattle. And the only real mic was Lanigan. So everybody else, I had Neumann KM84, which is a beautiful condenser microphone. Maybe not the best thing for this job, but and the studio was upstairs, right? So yeah, I ran a cable down the stairs of the studio and put the most expensive mic in the studio out on the street where somebody could have stolen it, I suppose. So that was picking up all of the action on the street. And then Mark Lanigan had an SM58 also on another long string of cables, also going down this other stairway to the studio. So probably about 300, 400 feet of mic cable all in all.
Wow. I guess, I mean, forget stealing it. It's lucky no one tripped over that thing and like disconnected you guys while you were.
Oh, yeah.
That's funny.
Well, it was dark. It was in the summer. You kind of had that neighborhood to yourself back then. If the cannery wasn't going, no one was down there, you know.
That's hilarious. So, I mean, when you, I guess, were playing that back in the studio, what did you think of the sound of it?
I thought it was beautiful. I'm from Evergreen, man. You know, we do weird shit, you know. So I thought this was remarkably arty, and I was proud of them for being so creative. And by the way, while we're talking about that street and that train station, Strange Out Here, which is the vaguely Morrison kind of thing on side 2 of Clairvoyance.
Okay.
There's a spoken word section about the blood runs thick down 3rd Street and takes the train over the mountain. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Well, that's the street.
That's cool.
And I wrote that.
Really?
Yes, we were working on the vocals, and I had some version of that in my head from some other party or something like that. He says, "Okay, Mark, this is what I think you should do. You know, write this down, you know."
That's actually really, really cool.
Yeah, it's in this city. Mark just did it perfectly. You know?
Yeah.
So yeah, Strange Out Here was a complete hoot to record.
That's a cool story. So if I may ask, I'm not exactly sure what the story is here. I know this was after you were no longer working with the Trees, but do you know why Barrett Martin replaced Mark Pickerel? Like, what was the story there exactly?
You know, there's an official version, and I can't remember it. But I think recording the first major, I mean, think about it. If there was more pressure for me, I mean, Clairvoyance was fun. And Invisible Lantern, you know, they were getting very serious about what they're doing, and there was levity, and they always had tremendous sense of humor, but they were, the pressure was on. So think about what it's like 2 records later, and they're signed, to a big label. They're working with producers they haven't worked with before. They're in, the big Knott's Berry Farm grunge studio, London Bridge, where that drum sound comes from and everything. I'm being whimsical about it. Friends of mine run it. It's a very lovely studio, and they made a great record. But I think going through all of that, I think Mark was getting kind of a little unhappy in the Screaming Trees by Invisible Lantern. I mean, he had lots and lots of ideas, and was taking drum lessons and kind of absorbing everything he could absorb about his music and the records that had come before him and all of that. And I think maybe he kind of outgrew the Screaming Trees first. Mark quit metaphorically, so as much as I have nothing but positive stuff from him today, I remember his ideas being shut down or ignored, and that's just how it goes in bands. It doesn't mean there's a bad guy, but there's people that have ideas, and they have to argue it out. And Mark was the youngest. He was the youngest. And yeah, I think there's parts of the Invisible Lantern record that were, less than fun. And, you make your decision to move forward. And for me, having one of my decisions overruled, well, I don't care. It's a service industry, and, I learned a lot working for them. I got a lot better at my job and a lot better at focusing on what the artist wants instead of what I want. And I made some foolish mistakes kind of trying to pursue what I want to do. But that's fine. My role is easy. But if it's your band and you're going to go play these songs on the road, and they're totally invested in it, when you don't get your way, it's a drag. It's a real drag. And Pickerel had some. It was about drum sounds and drum miking. It wasn't anything that was going to fuck anything up. And by the time Invisible Lantern was done, you couldn't hear the drums anyway. So that's all right. I'm not, that. So the idea that Mark bailed later on made sense to me. And y'all remember the band left for 2 months and joined Dinosaur Jr. So I think that was part of them just having more to do with the rest of the world and less to do with Ellensburg. Ellensburg became a bad place for the Screaming Trees. The Connor brothers were kind of hated by part of Ellensburg, because their dad was the principal at the high school, and some other shit, doesn't matter. But the point was, they'd be on MTV, and then they'd be going to buy gas, and some asshole that you hated from high school is pumping gas, and he goes, "Bet you think you're something now, huh? You're on the TV now. How about that?" That's a terrible version of Ellensburg. And Lanigan pointed out, I was having a blast at Ellensburg. I was, Bruce Pavin come over, and I'd show him around, and he'd write an article about it in the Rocket, and we worked on that crazy movie and all this other stuff. So like the longer things went on, I was having a blast at Ellensburg. I didn't want it to end, and the Screaming Trees were getting totally sick of Ellensburg, and one by one moving to the city.
I hear you.
So